Welcome, everybody, to a brand new episode of the Jams and Tea Podcast Radiohead Retrospective, where we cover the records from one of rock's most significant acts. Last week, we had a discussion about their incredible album, In Rainbows. We talked about the climate that created that record, what the band was going through, and the unprecedented way in which they released it, and as well as talking about what a shift it was musically for them. And this week, we are going to be covering the album after that, which is The King of Limbs. Tyler, what the fuck happened after In Rainbows to get us here?
Okay, well, quite a bit actually. Continuing work outside of Radiohead as well. Like we talked about how the band, Tom York released a solo record, his first solo record, The Eraser, the year before In Rainbows came out. Radiohead continuing to expand their works. In the interim, Johnny Greenwood, I believe, soundtracked a couple of movies for Paul Thomas Anderson. So there was a lot happening, and Radiohead as a group were evolving in this way that became, I guess, less fixed and more organic, and the idea of what Radiohead was as a musical entity was kind of shifting from record to record in a way that we've kind of talked about. It's worth noting as well, just as an aside, that Radiohead released 2 non-album tracks in 2009, I think. One called These Are My Twisted Words, which is very akin to the groove-based stuff that you hear on this record, although a little doomier and edgier. A really good song. If you haven't heard it, recommend checking that out. And they also released a string-based track called In Memory of Harry Patch, which is, I believe, a song that was dedicated to a British war icon who I sadly don't remember the biographical details of. But they released these 2 loose tracks in the interim, and there was a lot of, I guess, buzz building around where Radiohead would go after In Rainbows, which became reasonably quickly lauded as one of their most significant records for reasons we've all outlined. And an album that was immediately apparent as one of Radiohead's warmest, most organic sounding, least anxious, which I think is a kind of thing that we emphasize when we discuss that record. It felt like Radiohead were finding a new wind, finding a new kind of confidence in what they were doing. And so, of course, Radiohead being Radiohead, they really seek to upend that in a lot of ways with The King of Limbs. But it's also a little more complicated than that as well, because there are certain respects in which The King of Limbs very much it serves as a continuation of certain musical ideas of In Rainbows and the musical direction, but it does that in a distinctly different, darker way than that album. So we noted when we discussed In Rainbows that that record made use of looping structures in a lot of the musicality and the instrumentation that was used. Like Phil Selway's drum patterns were often played in this very kind of like static looping rhythmic pattern, and then the band were sort of constructing these tapestries of sound on top of them. And that's very much an approach that they continue to explore on The King of Limbs. In fact, they really kind of double down on it. The percussion on a lot of this record is intense. Much of it was recorded with 2 drummers and is played with 2 drummers. And again, that rhythmic focus that you can see evolving over a long time out of their interest in electronic music and dance music, and their desire to not really be a rock band, but to be a kind of electronic, multifaceted act, really feels like it reaches a fever pitch on this album, which is based around loops and loop construction, and Radiohead and Johnny Greenwood specifically using a manipulated version of Ableton to create sequences of music that Tom would write melodies and lyrics over top of, and create these very sort of like bustling, busy tapestries that sound very distinct to the more conventional sort of rock instrumentation that we're used to from Radiohead. These sound very much like, I guess, walls of sound at certain points. And I think also there's a distinct cleaving between the first and second halves of this record as well, which relates, I think, in intention and meaning to a lot of the thematic things that are explored by Tom on this record. He described it as a visual album for him in the process of writing. We've talked about his influence and drawing upon from fantastical pieces of storytelling and literature in the past. We talked about the influence of Dante on In Rainbows as well. And also when we talk about Hail to the Thief, we talk about Tom's interest in fairy tales and fables and myths and stories that basically present an ugly truth, or I guess present a beautiful vision of the world that is filtered through this ugly thing, things that are happening. And Tom's interest in fairy tale storytelling and that sort of ethereal nature thing is built on in King of Limbs. This is very much an album that continues Tom's fascination about environmental issues as well, and some of the lyrical subject matter that's on this record. And it is also a shorter Radiohead record as well. I believe it is the shortest Radiohead record up to this point. It is very punctual. It feels like it moves through these movements very quickly and ends in this very different place to where it begins, almost as though it is seeking to evolve in front of you. And it's also the most controversial Radiohead record, I would say, in terms of, maybe not the most controversial. I guess you could make a case for Amnesiac or something, but it tends to be a very divisive album that gets a lot of critique and was meted with a lot of confusion when it was initially released. So as a result of that, it puts the album in a curious position of being a little bit overlooked, but also distinctly being different in a way that feels less, I guess, exciting and holistic and fulsome than the best Radiohead records. It feels sparing. It feels almost unfinished in certain ways as well, which lends it to be a curious album for Radiohead and puts it in a weird position in the Radiohead discography. But I do think there's plenty to talk about in terms of what these songs do musically and what they're about. But I would like first to just, if I presume that he won't mind me putting him on the spot, to turn to August, and because I'm very curious about what your initial response and reaction was to this album, especially because you will have been aware of the lack of favor that it has in advance of hearing it, and what your feelings are generally on this record.
So my initial reaction to this was a bit of a lack of understanding, I'd say, kind of and to clarify, not really understanding the kind of animosity towards it, not really understanding a lot of the venom initially, because I was like, well, yeah, it's different, but that's just Radiohead. They're never consistent. They're always different. But I was also left with a little inkling of thinking, well, yeah, that's true. But at the same time, I do feel there's something here that feels distinctly off. And I couldn't put my finger on it initially. And I'll get into that more later into this review, how that seed of doubt kind of developed and grew as I was listening to this album more and more. But I initially spent most of my time listening to this with the kind of core studio tracks. And I'd say it was about halfway through the week, I checked out the basement sessions of this album. And at that point was when I started to have some clarity and understanding as to exactly what was going wrong here and why that seed of doubt had been planted. Which I think that's about the best way I can summarize my opinion on this album without getting too specific right up front.
Yeah, I can definitely see where you're going, and I'm going to head in a similar direction to you. I suspect we won't be alone either. I do also feel a bit bad in a certain sense, because I like when these episodes have like the full spectrum of opinions on these albums, and I can sense already that we're not necessarily going to get a very varied spectrum of opinions on this record. And I know for a fact that we have viewers who like this album a lot and consider it even one of their favorite Radiohead records, which I can't pretend to appease to that because I don't agree. But also at the same time, I want to treat this record fairly and stuff. And you guys know what I'm like. I always tend to play the devil's advocate for albums that are widely hated. So I'd love to really dig into what it is that this album's trying to do, what it is that this album fails to do, and what it is that this album does succeed to do. Because I think we'll all agree that this isn't a bad record. It's just a record that has some fundamental issues that are a little frustrating because they don't feel like they would be that difficult to fix. And so then you get put into the position of, why did they make these decisions then? Because, this is Radiohead. We have to give them the benefit of the doubt. They clearly made these decisions purposefully. But I also feel to a certain extent that the King of Limbs represents a sort of missed opportunity for Radiohead in certain ways as well, and a not quite fully realized execution of vision. Like, I believe that Radiohead 100% knew what they wanted to do going into this record, and I believe that they executed something that they were proud of, but I don't believe that they fully realized what they were going for. And that's a different thing to saying that the album is fundamentally misguided, because I don't think that. I think the album is good. I think the album has a lot about it that I really like. I think that the core of what the album is, again, the way that Tom digs into these really kind of natural, organic themes and his lyricism, and the way that blossoms in this beautiful way as the album progresses. I think all of those things are really good and interesting and beautiful at points as well. But I think that they are the ceiling that this album hits, because there are other aspects that stop it from being this multifaceted, beautiful thing that the best Radiohead records are, and that I think draw people's attention to the deficits. Because, most people will tell you, this is a good Radiohead album. It's a good album. It might not be one of the best Radiohead albums, but it's a good album. People will easily say that, and yet they will focus in hard on the deficits, because with a band like Radiohead, those things become glaringly apparent and doubly frustrating, generally speaking.
Well, I just wanted to say very quickly, and I just want to assuage your fears that we'll all be unified in this one very specific view of the album, because my view of it has grown a lot over time, because I paid attention to Roulette at the time, and I was very much of the opinion that album made Basement great. And it's not that I think the Basements aren't better than the record per se, but I've grown over time to love the record for what it is, and I want to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. I fully encourage that. I think a good place to maybe start this discussion, because all of these things I've introduced kind of coalesce, is just by talking about the opening track on this record, Bloom, which feels very much like everything that's emblematic about what's exciting and cool about this record, and frustrating at the same time. I think that Bloom is one of the best Radiohead songs. I absolutely love Bloom. I think it's rich, it's textural, it integrates these varied elements that should basically conflict with each other, but kind of work as a result of that. Like that shuffling drum beat that's in this thing that's looped, it's almost really off kilter and off key, and it's almost at odds with everything else that's going on, and yet it becomes hypnotic. It works. Colin's bass work on this track is fucking tasty, man. It's so good. That boom 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 thing he does is so nice, and he adds that real rhythmic anchor that is a nice dynamic counterpoint to Phil's very static playing, right? So it's great. The horns that come in the back half of this track sound huge, and Tom's vocals, his open your mouth, they sound like godly, like he's this kind of huge figure that's bigger than human. And all of these things are amazing. In the Basement version,
Okay, thank fucking God. I was a little bit worried there, because for a moment I was just kind of like, ironically, this is, a basement, but like, I feel like the studio, and I hate to do this because it's such an echoed sentiment, and even Sergio kind of alluded to it. It's that fucking, no matter how much I like the songs on the studio album, and some of them it's a lot, like Bloom is definitely in the higher half of my like track list here for the ones on the studio record, is that there's always a ceiling, because it's not even that, like, I think it just sort of tends to get compartmentalized. It's just like, oh, studio album, fucking basement thing better, and it's like, but it's the reason, distinctly, at least for me anyway, it's because the looping, the distinct approach that they're going here, the sort of furtherance of going into that sort of In Rainbows thing, but also the unique sound that this is going for, immediately fucking the production on the album, the studio album, is murky, it's muddy, it's directly antithetical to what the band is trying to accomplish. And then you listen to the live basement version and it sounds more organic, it sounds more full, it doesn't sound as stiff, and it flows and you can immerse yourself in it. And it's like, and even just the general mixing and all of the parts are so much better to recognize. And it's like Bloom is a great opener because it like fills itself in. It's just like one part of it starts, then it kind of like lets you go like and then the next part's introduced, and it's like spiraling outward, and it's such a great idea for a song, and it's immediately hampered if you hear that the studio album version of it first, because it's like the little like stiff sounding weird keyboard preset on it that's just a little bit and it's just like all these things kind of collide and wash, and it's just like Tom's voice is just a little too distant to really register, and then you hear the another version of it and it's like, this is a dream. This is exactly what I wanted this to be. What the fuck happened?
Yeah, the word I would use to describe the studio version is stiff.
Yes.
Which I think
Dry.
really hobbles it, because it's one of the dry good too, yeah. Because to me, it's one of the most dreamy Radiohead songs. Like at its core, like it's this very kind of lush track when it's heard and properly. And yet the production style of the first half of this record specifically, and again, I don't know if anyone else will agree with me on this, but I think the two halves of this record are very cleanly cleaved, and I feel quite differently about them, to be honest. But anyway, the production style of this first half of the record in particular really just kind of goes, like you said it, Jake, goes against what it feels like the band are trying to capture, and what Tom is trying to capture as well in his lyrics. I will say I narrowly think that his vocal performance is a little bit better on the studio record than the basement sessions, just because he really lets those notes hang out longer in the studio version. But other than that, I think I completely agree. Everything just sounds so
thin. The drums, especially on the first one, sound so thin.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be honest, it's one of the better sounding tracks, just in terms of mix alone, of the first half
absolutely.
of the album. Saoirse, sorry, you were going to say something.
No, I mean, it's interesting. This going to apply to the whole of the album, right? Well, I feel like I'm arguing against my younger self in a way that's slightly unfair, because I don't think the album's great, you know? And I do think the basement sessions are a better cohesive experience.
Mm-hmm.
But like, it is certainly true that the freer mixes of any live performance of these songs are going to be just more innately, viscerally rewarding.
Mm-hmm.
But I see a real beauty in that claustrophobia of the mixes.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, yeah, I fucking hated this record when it came out. Right?
Oh, I'm glad.
I was 13.
I'm glad.
I hated it.
I'm glad you're sticking up for it, Saoirse, because we need that, contrast.
To be fair, Saoirse, I warmed on the studio version more than I used to. This used to be my least favorite of all the Radiohead albums, but like, I came to like it's really like listening to this album and listening to the basement versions. I feel like it lets you more intimately become familiar with the songs, like as an abstract idea.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then you're just listening to the different incarnations that they take.
Mm-hmm.
And so you just kind of like the sound of it just becomes way more obvious and apparent to you if you like really put in the work that this kind of demands.
Yeah. Let me summarize why it doesn't work for me, right? Because I can get on board with the claustrophobic production style. I can get on board with Radiohead trying to do that and trying to really just kind of immerse you in that. The reason it doesn't work on King of Limbs is that first half of this record is fundamentally at odds with the second half of this record, which for me works, including the production style. I think there's a real lushness, even to the busier songs like Separator and Lotus Flower in the second half of the record. They sound so much clearer than anything on the first half of the record. Yeah. You can take in that dynamism, that dreaminess, especially Lotus Flower, which is just a fucking banger and it's so dynamic and layered and subtle and awesome. And it's like, if you want to do that claustrophobic record, why have these two halves at odds with each other? And perhaps,
in a way, you could argue if you wanted a claustrophobic record, you have like Amnesiac in a way, you know.
Perhaps you could argue that the two halves being so distinct is meant to represent something, right? Like night and day, or an arrival from in a clear state from an uncertain state. Perhaps you could argue that, but that to me is never really coalesced in the way that these songs interact with each other. But I'm sure that case could be made. But yeah, so that's ultimately where I'm at, is that if the whole record was like the first half, I probably would enjoy it less even still, but I would feel a sense of unification in terms of what was sonically being sought. In the same way that In Rainbows has that unification, despite the fact that there are variations in textures between songs. But King of Limbs doesn't have that. It feels like these two records that have been sort of pieced together. And when you listen to the Basement sessions, the mixes, although honestly, I actually prefer most of the mixes on the album for the second half to the Basement sessions, although it's not a huge difference. I think in particular, Lotus Flower sounds better on the album than in the Basement sessions. But that said, if you unify the ways in which all of these songs are mixed, like the Basement sessions mostly do, then you get a sense of a progression that feels much more natural, a sense of a flow that makes much more natural, especially when you resequence the Basement sessions into the album order like I did. You get a sense that of how these songs are related to each other much more.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. In the main episode, what we've been listening to, I talked about James A. Cass's podcast, Perfect Sounds. And in conjunction with the episode they did on a moon-shaped pool, they interviewed Colin Greenwood. And what he talked about was, one of the many things he talked about was the way the band have always embraced songs existing in multiple states at once, and that being a really valid thing, because he was talking about the fact that on a moon-shaped pool, so many of those songs have existed in live versions previously, and that's true of, like, videotape on In Rainbows, for example, and that's what I think is so interesting about the Basement compared to King of Limbs. It's not necessarily that, of course, like you, there's a version I think that's just more satisfying on a visceral level, but I think just both versions provide different artistic visions, and I think there's a lot of interesting stuff on the King of Limbs version that's worth addressing.
Totally.
And again, you alluded to the idea that you can make the argument of the progression between the first album and the second half, and I actually probably would make that argument as to why I really like the record.
I want to hear it.
But it's probably more, it's less like a black and white thing. It's more like a gliding scale. And it's not just on a production level, it's on an instrumentation level. Like, so there's so much like synthesizer, ambient, closed drum loop stuff in the first half of the record, but they bring in gradually more acoustic instrumentation, whether it's on Codex, that amazing brass work. And the point, I know. And you can bring out the card a year later, after this happened, after they recorded this, Transcendental Youth came out with the song White Cedar on it.
Hold up the sign! Hold up the sign!
Hold up the sign!
But yeah.
White Cedar.
I thought he was going to knock over that fucking tower of cans.
But White Cedar on Transcendental Youth is just like Codex in a different skin, But then you have acoustic guitar in that second half as well, and it's just bringing in gradually more and more different, very directly emotionally resonant instruments.
I get what you're saying, yeah.
But that half is so tight and so compressed, where it's like I feel so alienated from it, and I'm gradually brought into the world, and I find that incredibly rewarding. And for me, that's so representative of my journey with the album in the first place, where I was so held at a distance by it when it came out, and I've grown to love it over time. And I love it.
I'm thrilled for you, honestly. That's not sarcastic. But one emblematic thing that's emblematic of what you're saying that I love is, you're right, there is a kind of progression towards a more natural state as the album goes on. And that's one of the things I like about the album as a whole, is the way that it kind of has the sense of progression to it. Even if I think some of the mixing decisions really hobble it in certain parts, it still does have that progression. You go from these loops in the first half of the record, which are very sort of static loops of very cold instrumentation, to on a song like Give Up the Ghost, which is built around the same looping style, except it's used for the human voice. And it makes, and you see a through line being gone through there from the cold, clinical, industrial side of things to a warmth embrace of nature.
and like Lotus Flower is like right in the middle,
Yeah.
and that's a very electronic song with a real like human core to it,
Yeah, and it's the lyrics are
Um,
all very, very kind of evoking of nature as well, and of sort of transfiguration into natural states and stuff, things that Tom kind of gets into lyrically on certain songs. And it is like the
Yeah.
moment on the record where it starts to kind of click, it starts to sort of make sense what he's trying to do, and in terms of
Yeah.
the way it's all progressing.
And I just think it's just really important to remember that for Radiohead, ever since like OK Computer, something really core to what they do is songs existing in multiple states and that being a key part of a whole.
Sure.
I agree with this is so interesting to me because I feel like I'm going to come down in the center of everyone is probably being like, I'm probably going to be the coldest on the studio version and the warmest on the basement, which is a strange fucking place to be in because I agree with a lot of what you two just said in theory in regards to the existing in multiple forms and finding value in the studio version. The problem is for me is that the point that I simply don't agree with is the fact that I think not a single fucking song on here detriments from the basement version. I think they are uniformly, without exception, all better than the studio album, and I vastly, vastly prefer them. And there's sure like different ways to engage with it and all of that, but it's just even with like the two distinct halves thing, it's just like these songs just flat out do not fucking work for me the way they are intended to with the album mix. They simply are held back by one piece of the instrumentation being muted or some part of it being a little bit murkier, and it's infuriating now that I have that difference because I listen to each one individually and then like I can only hear the improvements on the version that I like and I only hear the detriments on the version that I like a little bit, at least marginally a little bit less. And it's like in theory, yeah, I love the idea of the songs existing in multiple forms, but the problem is that I wish they existed better in one version of it because I feel like they could do something to improve it but keep the vibe that they're going for. And honestly, that's also how I feel about the lyrics as well, is that this is a very different album lyrically from even in Rainbows, talking about nature, like Tyler said, is that like, and there are moments of it where it really evokes this sense of like primal tranquility, this kind of blending with nature and this kind of evolution over the course of the track list. And yet I find so much of it to be so vague that I just can't latch on to any of it. Like I can appreciate the differences and I get the approach that they're going for. It's just an approach that I don't really think works all that well. I just look and analyze some of these. Like some of them are songs like Little by Little, where it's like kind of standard Radiohead fare for at least for what they're doing. But songs like Bloom, one of my more preferred songs on this, on either version, it sure, I mean, okay, it kind of evokes some cool imagery, but it's just kind of like there, you know?
I think I can give some context to the lyricism, but I don't want to do that just yet because we haven't heard from Morgan yet. And I feel like Morgan, you could probably compliment what Jake's been saying and maybe what some of us have been saying as well. And then maybe after that we could circle back to August because I know August said he had thoughts that related to the more specifics, and you might be able to get into them as well.
Yeah, it is complicated. So I have Give Up the Ghost as my least favorite on the King of Limbs core album. And this is not at all because I think it is a bad song. In fact, it's because I think it's a fantastic song that sounds just so much better on the basement version.
Yep.
Like it's God, a song that begs for organic instrumentation, and it's dulled and muted on the album version, and I find it infuriating. That's a sort of microcosm of a lot of the album. I have Morning Mr. Magpie on as one of my top 3 of the main album, and even then I'm listening to that and I'm like, yeah, but the guitar just sounds so much fuller.
It's like it's straight funky in the basement version. Like that to me, that song, I'm glad you brought it up, is my favorite example of an improvement from the original on the basement record. I think it sounds so much more full of that rhythmic heft in the basement version. And also there's just a moment in the studio version of Morning Mr. Magpie towards the end right near the end of the song, where it all gets like really intense. Like it just gets really intense, like everything layers on top, and it sounds fucking compressed. It sounds bad. It sounds really bad towards the end of the song, where everything is kind of just in your ears and just like in conflict. And you listen to the basement version of Magpie, and that isn't there at all. It's much more compellingly performed, and it reaches a much more satisfying resolution because there's space. And we're starting to get a bit redundant with this point, but it has to be emphasized. Space is the key. And I get it, right? Especially because it complements the lyrics, right? Because the lyrics in the first half of this record are really like claustrophobic, like "Good morning, Mr. Magpie, you've stolen all my magic, give it back." Little by little, routines and schedules, drugs that kill you, all that sort of stuff. And then the lyrics in the back half of the record, like you compare Little by Little's lyrics to Codex, for example, and you've got this beautiful song about escaping and jumping into water. And yeah, I get it. There's the contrast, but I mean, it's hard to really dig into that with certain elements of the mixing on a song like Morning, Mr. Magpie, and it's really hard to appreciate that. And again, it feels like that vision of clustered, claustrophobic first half, open, beautiful second half is a good vision. It's not a bad idea conceptually for these songs. It's just not executed well.
I mean, it's so weird for me because like I have been in exactly the position where like these are the thoughts that I once had, you know. But then like now I hear so many like the critiques of the mixes on these songs and like the criticisms you give, even though I do still prefer the basement versions. I'm like, but yes, but that's still kind of why I like it. Like that's still kind of why they work for me.
Sure.
You know?
Yeah, I think that there's certainly some people out there who'd agree with you. Anyway, I interrupted you, Morgan. Continue with what you were saying.
Yeah, but I also do want to clarify that, like, for the sake of a scale, the basement version of this album is still like an 8 out of 10 for me. Like even if this version, if that was the version of the album that came out, it would still by no stretch of the imagination be one of my favorite Radiohead albums. And I think to that just speaks in general to the sort of disconnect that a lot of people feel towards this, despite mixing and everything, is that a lot of the people just don't really feel like the songs are fully there, which is not really a problem that I relate to, but I certainly see where they're coming from.
Yeah. It's also that in tandem with the fact that it is such a short album as well.
Yeah.
And the other difference between this and the Basement Sessions is that they give you more songs in the Basement Sessions. Specifically, the Daily Mail and Staircase, which were released as a double-sided single.
Two of the best songs from this period of their career that are not on the album.
Yeah, I also chucked on the basement version of Super Collider into my mix as well, but it's worth noting, just for your context, that was actually originally a bonus track on the basement release, so you can discount that if you want to.
Tyler, I'm really glad you shared your mix with us, because personally, like, despite like, you know, whatever reservations I have about this album, I have been listening to your version that you shared with us constantly this week, and all of my affinity for this album comes from the fact that I listened to it in that context. So I would have been like that is now the version I will listen to for years, because I vastly prefer it.
I've been hoisting it, my specific mix, because I that's the thing I'm annoyed about with the fact with the Basement Sessions is they never actually released the audio. They released a video version of it, and the original Basement recording, the songs are played in like a random concert order that doesn't flow at all. Like
yours is much better.
I put them in a better sequence. And I also think that, and I'll get into this a bit later on, the Daily Mail and Staircase, which I absolutely think should have been on the original record, would be great at filling it out and serving as bridges. Like they don't even like contradict the two halves of the record. Like Daily Mail, I think, which I slotted in for our viewers after Feral, is like a great bow around the first half of the album thematically, and in terms of this climax that it reaches as well. And then Staircase, I think, works as an intro into the second half of the record beautifully as well, and even leads into Lotus Flower. And then if you want to throw Super Collider in there as well, I put it in the dead center because it's kind of like an intermission that works as this point that I feel like that connects the two. So it's like the material was all there and it just needed to be pieced together. And
it's made even worse when the fact that the two singles are not mixed in the way that the King of Limbs is mixed. They're mixed.
That's the thing. The versions on Basement, which are the versions I put on that mix, obviously, they sound identical to the single versions of the Daily Mail and Staircase. That's why I didn't bother to say go and listen to the original Daily Mail and Staircase, because they sound identical. And it's like, okay, you made these. It's particularly Staircase, right? Because Staircase is much closer to the sound of the rest of the record than Daily Mail.
More.
And so you can use that as a comparison point, right? That's a busy song. There's a lot going on there. There's a really nice kind of dum 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 start stop groove that's happening. There's some of my honestly favorite ever guitar work from Johnny Greenwood or Ed O'Brien, whichever is doing it's probably Ed, knowing Ed, who's doing the kind of like ringing sounds in that song that kind of sweep over it like a string arrangement. Sounds huge as shit. So it's like, that is a beautiful, again, tightly compact but spacious mix, even though it's a really claustrophobic song. So I don't understand why that. Yeah, you get the point.
I mean, it's interesting in a way, like the way that In Rainbows like takes a trajectory in one direction for Radiohead, but keeps like elements of another trajectory they could have gone in. And then this album takes that one trajectory they were looking to go in and just does a whole album like that. And then their next record is totally different.
Well, we'll save that. Won't look ahead in any of these videos as much, whether we already have. But like, you can see like Weird Fishes and Reckoner, right? They're constructed in very similar ways to the songs on this record. I don't really think In Rainbows and King of Limbs are that different, honestly. I mean, they both have a kind of more worldly theme lyrically as well, if you want to call it that. So it's like the fact that there's such this disparate distance, like In Rainbows has like a 4.18 rating on Rate Your Music, and King of Limbs has like a 3.27. So that's like an almost 1 point difference between those ratings. And I guess speaks to how damaging the lack of connection that people have been able to, or the struggle that people have had with connecting with this record. And again, I say that carefully because I feel like it is definitely their intention to make a record that has that sort of style, but is deliberately more abrasive, deliberately more claustrophobic, you know, because bands do that. They react to their previous record, right? Especially if it's widely acclaimed. So I get that it's intentional. And it's like, I don't want to be that kind of person who, I want Radiohead to sound like this. Radiohead should sound like this. But it's this weird place where I'm put in of almost having to do that because it feels like they're not, they're hobbling their own concept. And I've said that a million times now, so I'm going to stop.
In a way though, like you look at like, you know, Kid A introduced all these ambient IDM influences. Amnesiac is the much more compressed claustrophobic version of that.
Yeah.
Even Hail to the Thief brings some more rock influences, but has lots more like ambient-y, IDM-y tracks and Radiohead records before Kid A. And then in Rainbows, although it still has that influence like a little bit, it's much more like a rock album, you know?
It totally feels like the In Rainbows King of Limbs dichotomy, and I'm just thinking this now, is totally analogous to the Kid A Amnesiac dichotomy.
Right. Yeah. Then, like Kid A is like, find a guitar on like 2 tracks, you know? So many of it is focused around those like IDM influenced drum loops and those ambient moods with the bass work building up a slow bass driven like lie down, eat like a sheet of acid and get high ambient feeling, you know? And it's just interesting to me. Like it's almost like from the OK Computer to Kid A split, it's like a tree of Radiohead family, like a Radiohead family tree of genre branching out slowly, and you can place each album in like a ring around it, you know?
I think something that goes a long way to explaining the disconnect as well is just that generally speaking, these songs sound sort of dispassionate in a way that even like Amnesiac doesn't. And really any stretch on it. I certainly won't say anybody on this album sounds bored or uninspired, because they certainly have an idea and they keep their performances within the framework of those ideas. But, sometimes an album that is meant to feel sort of stilted and less passionate, especially when compared to In Fucking Rainbows, it's not necessarily going to translate in that way.
I guess really I agree with a lot of what's been said so far about the reasons as to why this album doesn't work. This whole idea of it feeling a little non-committal and stiff as a whole. That's really, in my opinion, the best way I would summarize this whole thing. But I wanted to focus more on what I like about this album, as a matter of fact. I think the thing that hasn't quite disappeared from them is their writing for the most part. Granted, there are tracks like Feral, which are fairly bland, uninspired, and underwritten tracks. But then you've got a song like, then you've got Bloom, which is a really beautiful, environmentally conscious song. And in the same breath is a metaphor for dependency in a relationship, whether that be a relationship of just an addiction, as could be more vividly pointed to with this idea of oxygen producing plankton, or a relationship between two people. I think that's a really strong, classic feeling Radiohead opener to this album. I like moments like a Lotus Flower, which comes in halfway through. It's got this really nice central bass line, which I think is a consistent strong point, even if the actual drums themselves on the actual studio version aren't all that. I think the bass still manages to be a fair high point across the whole thing. And that's really what keeps me engaged. I mean, I think Lotus Flower just has a really core to it. I think this is some of Tom's best, most expressive singing. I think the vocal melodies are on here are really strong. And this back half as a whole is where this record kind of shines. I think Codex is just another very classically pretty sounding Radiohead song, really heavily indulging in this idea of some, I think, could interpret it as suicide. I take it more on the lines of just a general malaise and dissatisfaction with the world, rather than taking it to the extreme.
That is, I don't think they've been mentioned explicitly yet, but the muted piano sounds
of
that song are so like unique and pretty, and like such a nice like little thing. Like in any other band would just do straight piano with maybe some effects on it, but that's the real muted texture it has, adds a lot to the emotionality of the way it feels, I think.
Yeah, and I think it lands as this very it lands as almost like a pyramid song on this album in terms of how it feels emotionally, and I guess ultimately how also a little disconnected it is from the whole. But yeah. One other aspect I like about this album is that I think the minimal song structures lend themselves fairly well to this whole unification of the album. No one song on here really has this grandiose, sweeping writing structure. It's all very minimal, very non-traditional. And that's obviously kind of to complement these minimal, repeated drum patterns across the album's first half. And I think that gives it a real personality in the band's catalog, making something that is so concise, so just in its own world, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And I gotta say, I really love the closer here, Separator.
Yes, me too.
the reverb drenched vocals initially took me out of this song, but once you get to that back third and you kind of see them fade away and shift into the cleaner, brighter vocals in this song's closing portion, the purpose to what Tom is doing here becomes so incredibly evident. And I really love how this song closes out the album.
Yeah, it's just a great, again, another example of the looping nature of the second half of the record is less kind of overt than the first half, but it's still kind of present. And I love the way that it becomes more subtle and slow in its development. And Separator is a great example, right? You have that kind of main groove and bass line that start the track and are anchoring it. And that bass, where again, shout out Colin, the bass line on Separator is fucking dope. That dum, 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 dum is awesome. But then when that kind of guitar comes in, like about halfway through, it's like the sun peering through the clouds, right? It automatically adds this entirely new tone and texture and color to the song. And the way that it's deployed in that way where it holds off from introducing that until the song's like halfway done, really gives it an impact.
And in a sense, this song having so much proverbial color to it is what is really, the biggest disappointment of the whole album, that they had the capacity to do this in the studio during these specific sessions, and they clearly knew where this color and texture to their music was. It just is scarcely present on the majority of the album. And like I said, I don't think the writing is even bad or noticeably worse for the most part. I think it's still Radiohead delivering classic emotive tunes about grander societal decay and concepts of their kind of ilk. I just think it's the presentation which hinders so much of this here.
So August, on that note then, how do you feel the Basement Sessions compare to the album? And particularly, and also the notion of the fact that there are additional songs on the Basement Sessions, and whether you feel additional tracks would have enhanced the record, or whether you feel it's a good length as it is.
Well, my sarcastic answer is, they're way better. But seriously, I think the most noticeable improvement comes pretty immediately on when I'm listening to Bloom. The studio version is this very stilted, rigid intro. And I remember listening to the Basement version and hearing that guitar part come in during the intro, which just added a whole new world of color and character to this song that made that intro so much more fast-paced and snappy. And this was just during my first time listening to this. And that was what really contextualized why this album didn't work for me, because it was missing something. It's missing something extra, that color, that real dazzlement that Radiohead can often so easily weave into their music. And I mean, I think on the first half, it's uniformly an improvement, although I do think that the weak points of the album are still weak points of the Basement Sessions. Like, I still don't think Feral is all that, even when you give it the extra flourish.
I think the Basement version of Feral definitely sounds better just because it's a bit more dynamic, but it's still like ultimately fundamentally an unfinished song.
Yeah, and that's where I think that's a good place to kind of speak of the Basement Sessions, is that it fixes those surface level and presentation issues, but the fundamental issues in some of the writing still pervade through it. So I guess that's what ultimately confuses me, that people act like it's this massive, unparalleled step up, because it just makes me question what they appreciated about the original version of King of Limbs. Like, it makes me wonder, like, did you not already like how these songs were written? Did you not already like the metaphor and ideas going into them, because it feels like if you didn't like that to begin with, it wouldn't translate over to those recordings. But for so many people, it does and doesn't, evidently, which I just find a little
I guess it probably comes down to how highly people regard Sonics in terms of Radiohead and atmosphere, and what the dynamics of what they do, and how the beauty in Radiohead actually as well, which I think King of Limbs pointedly avoids, with maybe the exception of Codex. It's just not a very beautiful album, and people I think struggle with that ugliness that it has in appearance, and the removal of as much of that ugliness as possible makes the record make more sense as a Radiohead record, and then makes, I guess, the ideas of the nature theme and a lot of what Tom is sort of singing about translate a little bit better in a way that I think does noticeably elevate the general quality. And additionally, the inclusion of additional songs, particularly Daily Mail and Staircase.
And look, I'm not going to disagree that doesn't, at the end of the day, it still does overall elevate the quality of the album. I will never disagree with that. I think it makes a lot of the songwriting and its purpose a lot more in tandem with what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah. I'm not, while I'm kind of getting at the notion that I might disagree, I don't. I agree with your thesis there completely. But also, yes, the Daily Mail is an amazing song, as is Staircase.
Yes, I'm so glad to have more people on Team Staircase. No one talks about that song.
Rules.
It's so good.
Yeah, that song.
You say it's climbing up the rankings.
Staircase is just frankly my favorite song from this whole era, I think, weirdly enough. Which I guess I don't.
Daily Mail's one of mine.
Staircase and Bloom are the two, I think, highlights.
They certainly stepped up with that track.
I'm gonna kill myself.
If I can just speak really quickly as to something that August mentioned in regards to the difference between them stepping up, is that yes, they do have the two additional songs, which are two of the better songs on this collection of songs, but also you have to remember too, that includes a quantitative difference as well, in that, like, in terms of, like, that means that the weak points are still the same, but overall they still represent a smaller fraction of a whole that's larger, that has way better material, if I'm being honest, if I can speak to that part of myself that does think it's a very big improvement.
Yeah, I think Feral is a good example of that point as well. Like, I still think ideally, in an ideal world, it would be replaced by a better song that serves the same purpose at that point. And I didn't take it out of the basement sessions because I didn't want to fuck with what they did. And also I couldn't figure out a way to do that anyway in my own personal life without fucking up the pacing and sequencing.
No, they should have finished it.
But yeah, so like, but then, yeah, so that, but like Feral becomes a much smaller quantity of the whole when you have more songs and when you have it more filled out.
Yeah, I think. And just to briefly get back to Staircase, because I did not realize this was some undersung song. I got to talk about this real quick. I love how funky the bass line at the center of this is, how tribal the drumming feels. It is a song that just feels alive in the best sense possible. It's a blending of like different musical styles that coalesce in a way that feels like it would be hard to just capture the raw energy on just a recording, but evidently they do, because it's so, because it obviously translates for me. Yeah.
You, as the kids say, were spitting. Just hawking a big old loogie.
Well, okay. Well, is there anything else anyone wants to add on this album before we move into favorite tracks and ratings?
I'll just speak in a broad sense that, like, if you have, like, dismissed this album in the past, and you know what, understandably so, and you've probably heard about the basement thing a couple times from a couple of people, but even as somebody, like Morgan said earlier, it's just like, even if this album was the basement version and all of Tyler's improvements that he made to his version of the album were put on there, like, my rating changes pretty significantly, and I'll say as to how. But it also definitely is still not going to be one of the better Radiohead records. That said, it is still, like, as somebody who loves this band, but still, there's a lot of the band's work that just kind of doesn't really work for me. This is worth trying to put work into if you want to, like, explore some of these sounds. Like, maybe the studio version will grow on you like it has Sersha, or maybe if you listen to the basement version enough, you'll really grow to love that. Because honestly, I have my problems with it, but as a collection of songs and as a slight kind of diversion in this band's catalog, I really appreciate it. It's got some of their best material on it. It's totally worth digging for.
Yeah, like I would say, as like a caveat, as a compliment to that, rather, if you are like me and it came out and you hated it because you liked everything they made before that, give it another try. For the love of God.
I feel like most people who are most likely to watch this video are probably people who like the album probably more than us.
Well, they'll still get a refreshing change of pace because nobody fucking talks about the good parts of this album, of which there are many.
And we want to hear from people as well what they think and why they like it.
Yeah, I just do want to note that I hate the fact that I have to be like harping on the negatives of this.
Me too.
In some ways, because it's definitely a good album as was sent out originally. But we're also talking about the biggest fucking band in the world, and you have to kind of take a step back if you want to lend some nuance to your own opinion.
Yeah.
Because I also just see the way that I would have reviewed this like 5 years ago and would have been like, yeah, it's not really the band's best work, but it's still like really good. And like the way I would have reviewed it 5 years ago is full of excuses.
Yeah.
And I want to avoid that as much as possible.
I think we've all done a great job of not compromising on our own feelings. And Morgan, I think if you need any more clarity for your sake, you only need to go back and watch your Amnesiac video where you hold your guns on that record admirably.
Yeah.
And I kind of fumble all over the place saying, well, this, but yeah, anyway.
Hey, it's okay. I was with Morgan and I did exactly that.
Well, I mean, we all did some fumbling.
Yeah. But let's fumble towards ecstasy. And here's an idea that I had that I thought would be quite cool is let's do our favorite tracks and ratings and least favorite track for King of Limbs. And let's do that also for the basement sessions. And just for my own personal amusement, and I think maybe for our viewers' amusement as well. And just to clarify the extent to which we feel our opinions differ between the two, if at all.
Yes.
So Jake, why don't you lead off first with your 3 favorite tracks from the King of Limbs, least favorite track rating, and then your 3 favorite tracks on the Basement album, least favorite and rating.
All right. For the studio version of the King of Limbs, my 3 favorite tracks are Bloom, Separator, and Codex. My least favorite song on there, it's between Feral and Give Up the Ghost. I'm out of principle, I want to say Give Up the Ghost, but I think Feral, if I just had to say what is the least compelling song on there, it's that one. So I'll go with Feral. And for me, that's a 6 out of 10. And the basement version that I'm talking about here, by the way, is Tyler's resequenced one, because frankly, I don't give a shit. This is going to be the version of this that I listen to. Don't really give a crap. Like, I don't care how they sequenced it on the other thing.
Incidentally, for our viewers, I will put a link to this in my Google Drive in the description of this video, because I want as many people to experience this as possible. And I want to clarify as well that I haven't fucked with the songs that are on it. It's still the same songs. I've just made it the sequence of the album and put the bonus tracks in the middle because I feel like they fit better there than anywhere else.
And also, they haven't released that as an album.
Yeah. So fuck them.
So yeah, for one, you fucking do it, you losers. For another, whatever. There's no rules.
So on the other one, I'm going to. This would change. Conditionally, but since I know 2 people here are probably going to stick up for Staircase, I'm going to say that on the basement version, Tyler's version, the Daily Mail is probably my favorite song on here. But I would also like to toss, I do really also love Separator on this, and I love its ending, but I'm going to say this version of Give Up the Ghost just because of how much more of an improvement it is. And I'm gonna say, I'm gonna say Morning Mr. Magpie. That's a big grower. Least favorite track on here is still probably Feral. If I'm being honest, the improvement improves that the list. Yeah, it's fine.
Yeah,
and that version of the album, in my opinion, is a light 8.
Okay.
My three favorites are on the normal album are Codex, Morning Mr. Magpie, and Separator. Least favorites, I am going with Give Up the Ghost on Principle. And overall, I would give it a 6.5. The basement version, I would say my three favorites are Super Collider, Codex again, and Staircase. And least favorite is Feral. Colin. And my rating is an 8 out of 10.
Oh my. Okay, so for the studio version, my favorite tracks are Codex, Lotus Flower, and Little by Little, let's do that. I'm going to give it a 7.5 out of 10. It's been so long since I listened to the Basement Session, so you're trying me, but I'll say Bloom, Daily Mail, and Feral, and I'm not going to give it a rating. It's just been too long.
Okay. Fair enough. I've just realized that we barely ever touched on the song Little by Little, which I actually like quite a bit in both forms. I think it's one of the songs of the songs on the first half of the original record. I think it's one of the least irritating in terms of that mixing issue, although it does sound better on the Basement Sessions, it has to be said. That riff, it's not even really a riff, but there's kind of ascending guitar line is really catchy. And like you say, the hook is great as well from Tom. It's just a really cool combination of sounds on that track, much like something like Staircase as well. So yeah, that's a good song. Anyway, my three favorites on the OG album are Bloom, Lotus Flower, and Separator. My least favorite on the OG is Feral. And I'll say this, I won't say favorites on the Basements, but I'll say the ones that stand out to me the most on the Basement are Morning Mr. Magpie, Staircase, and probably Bloom again. And my least favorite on the Basement Sessions in terms of the most disappointing track on the Basement Sessions for me is actually Lotus Flower, which I vastly prefer on the album, but it's still good. So I'm going to give the original King of Limbs a 7, and I'm going to give the Basement Sessions an 8.
Okay, wonderful.
August.
Favorites on the studio version are Lotus Flower, Codex, and Separator. Least favorite is Feral. I give the studio version a 5.5 out of 10.
Neato.
For the Basement Sessions, favorites are Staircase, Bloom, and I'll say Morning Mr. Magpie also. And least favorite here, Feral again. And I give this version a 7.5.
Oh,
baller.
2 points.
Pleasantly surprised.
Baller.
So for the original studio album version, that's a 6.5 out of 10. Fairly low for a Radiohead record, I think we'd all agree.
Mm-hmm.
We've only had 2 records to have that rating, that being Atlas of Ending by Metz and American Head by the Flaming Lips.
This currently puts King of Limbs as our second lowest rated on average Radiohead record, which is funny because it seems to me like the tone of our Amnesiac video was much more contentious than this one, and it has a higher average.
Yeah,
that's weird.
But anyway,
keyword there is contentious, and we were all pretty much in agreement on this one.
That's true. And then the Basement Sessions, Saoirse?
It's a 7.9 average, much higher, unsurprisingly. Which matches stuff like Tubular Bells, in Saturday Night Wrist, Devon Townsend's Addicted, De La Soul's Dead, some rap songs.
Cool. Okay, so let us know in the comments below what you think of this album and its accompanying basement version if you want. Let us know what your favorite tracks are. Let us know what you think of our takes as well on what this record is trying to do, the concept, the execution. We dug a little bit into the lyricism as well, but if you want to dig any deeper as well in our comments, feel free to do that too. And yeah, next week we'll be back with the very last episode of this series on their most recent album, Moonshaped Pool. And in that video as well, we'll be giving our favorite Radiohead songs and Radiohead album rankings. So stick around for that. It's going to be a really interesting conversation. It's been nuts. So yeah, main episode this week was on Billie Eilish and Bleachers. Go and check that out. We also have a record club out a couple of days ago on Mr. Bungles, California. So yeah, plenty going on at the moment. Make sure you like and subscribe if you haven't already. And we look forward to seeing you again next time.
As always, everyone, rock over London, rock on Chicago, Rubik's Cube, over 3 billion combinations, but just one solution.